Which frame generation tech is the best option for Star Citizen? We have a bit of a face-off here. We've got the independent and very impressive Steam program Lossless Scaling, and it's recently had a very interesting update. We've then got Nvidia's new driver level smooth motion frames, which is only available on the 50 series cards, and well, it kind of had some problems. And then we've also got AMD's fluid motion frames, their driver level solution, which is now version 2.1 and supports 6000, 7000 and 9000 series cards. I've done some testing, and so I'm going to give them points in 4 different categories: image quality, latency, ease of use and availability. And by the end of this video, you should have a pretty good idea of the pros and cons of each option. First of all, let's look at image quality, and I've used my 9800 X3D system with the 5080 for Nvidia and the 9070 XT for AMD. And you can see here at full speed, Nvidia smooth motion looks pretty good on the whole. On the whole, their image quality is pretty decent. If you keep an eye on the left, on the UI, on the kind of compass map thing over there, you can see that there are flickers, and that will be the case with all of them. But on the whole, Nvidia's image quality itself is very good. There's other issues though. Moving on to lossless scaling, again, image quality is pretty decent. We're going to slow everything down in a minute and look at them side by side. But as you look at the full screen image at full speed, so we're using a 120 FPS camera here and basically locking the footage to 120 FPS, it looks pretty good under these circumstances. And it's worth saying that I've got a kind of best case scenario set up here. You don't really want to use FrameGen stuff with Star Citizen at lower frame rates. It doesn't look so great. And then AMD's AFMF, the fluid motion frames, again, looking at it at full speed, it's pretty decent, but I think there is kind of more flickering and artifacting going on. Again, look at the side of the screen there. There's just more moments, I think, when things just go a little bit wrong. And as we now put them side by side with the kind of non-frame generation version on the left, we've slowed this right down, so 25% speed to get a real good look. And again, looking at the UI elements, first of all, like we said, if you look at that kind of bit down the side, it will judder on all of them. But there are other issues as well. So if you look at these grates on the left there, as you go past here on the lossless scaling one, you can see issues. And just as you go around the corner, the side of the screen on the AMD AFMF just isn't as good. Again, look at this grate here. There's just much more movement and flickering going on. And there is some on lossless scaling. But if I was to rank these in order, I would definitely say that on the whole, Nvidia's image quality is the best. I'd then give it to lossless scaling next, and then AMD's AFMF. So we'll give 3 points to Nvidia, 2 points to lossless scaling, and 1 to AMD. Next up, I did a load of latency testing. If you've seen my previous videos on lossless scaling, you'll have seen that I've got this little device that allows you to shoot a wall repeatedly, and it does an average of all the kind of the latency. So it's pretty cool. Still getting used to it, and I wouldn't necessarily say these results are maybe like the most scientifically accurate one, but they should be accurate compared to each other. So it gives us a good idea. So looking at this graph, you can see that on the left, we've got just the AMD system with the 9070 XT with no frame generation. That's just the latency on its own, and same for Nvidia next to that. And then as we go through, we're adding different modes. Now, you can just turn on Nvidia low latency mode and AMD's equivalent anti-lag, but for some reason that doesn't improve performance here. It actually makes the latency worse, it seems. But then as we move across, we've got AFMF, then the lossless scaling ones with Nvidia, lossless scalings with AMD, and then Nvidia smooth motion with there's lots of things going wrong there. So let's just talk about this. So the Nvidia stuff performed pretty well with lossless scaling, as you can see there. The low latency mode also gained a few milliseconds, which is good. But yes, the smooth motion results themselves there's just some issues going on here. And the worst result on the right there is when I limited the overall frame rate to 120 FPS, because that's what we're doing in these tests. So make sure that it's matching the monitor, but also matching the camera. And for some reason, latency just goes through the roof there. And I don't really know why. It doesn't seem to just like that combination of things. The next result along with smooth motion is just with low latency mode on, which is always on whenever you turn on smooth motion. But then I've uncapped the frame rate. So we are going above 120 FPS, but still the latency isn't great. it's the next worst result. So there's just generally some problems, it seems, or at least I'm struggling with smooth motion with my 5080. Yeah, we'll talk a bit more about that because there are more things that we'll have to get into with that. AMD's AFMF result, which also has got anti-lag on by default, that's how that works, is actually pretty impressive. At 68 milliseconds, it's not too far off having no FrameGen on, so that's really quite good. But for some reason, the AMD combination with lossless scaling is worse than the Nvidia one. So again, they're not terrible, but you have increased your latency by quite a big amount, nearly 20 milliseconds more with lossless scaling on the AMD side. So yeah, that does go against that combination, unfortunately. Lossless scaling itself, just to talk about that, when you combine it with Nvidia side, the low latency mode seems to make a bit of a difference here again, and that isn't that far off AMD's AFMF. But yeah, again, you have increased your latency, and under certain circumstances, we talked about this before when I looked at this, there are certain scenarios where you're playing this game, depending on what you're doing, if you're trying to do any kind of Twitch-based shootery stuff, anything that really requires kind of reactions, and yeah, that sort of stuff doesn't play all that nicely with this. But if you're chilling out doing some mining and you want to double your frame rate, it works pretty well. So I'm gonna score, I'm gonna give 1.5 for lossless scaling here, because you do take a hit from the latency. We'll give Nvidia 1 because I don't want to give it 0, but it's not working very well, or at least for me, using all of the stuff that I know about this, and I'm pretty good at troubleshooting, I can't get my setup to work very well with it. So we'll give that 1, and we'll give AMD's AFMF, we'll give it 2 points, because it's not perfect, but it is pretty good. Next, let's look at the ease of use. So Nvidia, this should just be as easy as turning it on in the Nvidia app. You limit your frame rate then, so you don't go past your monitor's refresh rate, and then off you go. But as we talked about in the latency section, I had loads of issues just getting this to run properly. And on top of that, it was by far the most crashy of the 3 options. Nvidia just seems to have loads of driver issues in general at the moment. There's all sorts of reports. There was a hot fix out the other day because something's broken. I play other games that just are crashing all the time now. So there are issues, and it is a weird place to be where Nvidia's drivers have completely gone to pot, but that's where we stand at the moment. Lossless scaling, from an ease of use point of view, has one major trick up its sleeve. It has adaptive frame generation. So you enter your target frame rate, and it will dynamically adjust the multiplier to maintain that frame rate. So you don't have to faff around with capping your frame rate at all or anything like that. And the only real thing that stops lossless scaling getting 3 points here for ease of use is that you do have to switch your game to windowed or borderless mode. And I have had people just not able to get this working who've commented on the previous lossless scaling videos. It's not that complicated, but it's probably not as straightforward as the other options. You don't just turn it on and it's done. You do have to at least make sure your game is in the right windowed or borderless mode. And I have also observed that there is a higher GPU performance hit, and it can be quite hefty when using lossless scaling. So in order to get this working as well as possible, you may have to fiddle around with the settings a little bit to get the best performance, but do some Googling. All that information is out there on the internet. AFMF works the same way as smooth motion. You basically turn it on in the Adrenaline software, and then you'll need to limit your frame rate to your monitor's refresh rate. And it's, other than that, pretty straightforward. And ultimately, I'm sure that both Nvidia and AMD will eventually end up copying lossless scaling's adaptive FrameGen, because that just seems the absolute obvious way for this all to go forward. You just enter the frame rate that you want, and then you let the software take care of all the scaling for you. That will, I'm sure, be the long-term future of this. But for now, we're going to give Nvidia a 0, because it's genuinely been horrific trying to get this all working and get anything to show you here. It really doesn't like my system, at least. Then we'll give lossless scaling 2, because it could be easier, but it's pretty good. And we'll give AFMF a 2 as well, because again, you do have to go and faff around limiting the frame rate. Then let's talk about availability. So Nvidia has locked smooth motion to the 50 series cards, and there's probably no real good reason for this other than to make the 5000 series cards look slightly more appealing. It is not a great move. They probably could easily get this running on the 4000 series at least, but I suppose at least it's free, which Lossless Scaling isn't. So we'll give Nvidia, let's give them 1.5 points for this one. So Lossless Scaling, like I say, does cost money, but it's so little that I don't think that really factors into much. And it also can just be applied to all sorts of different GPU options on the market. So it's a pretty great and universal option. So we'll give it 2.5 points, but yeah, it does cost a little bit. And then AMD, they're supporting their last 3 generations of cards and it's free. So I suppose really we probably should give them the full 3 points for that one. The other thing we just probably want to talk about to finish off here is that none of these versions are kind of inbuilt into the game. So at some point, we are hoping for both Nvidia and AMD support for proper frame generation in the game. My suspicion is that that will come, but I think it will be coming with Squadron 42. I keep saying this. I think when Squadron comes out, CIG are going to want to chuck everything at it, all the latest bells and whistles, ray tracing, all that sort of stuff, but also frame generation technology. And so we don't know this, but I would be shocked if we don't get proper Nvidia and proper AMD support for Squadron 42, and therefore at some point after that, Star Citizen. So in total, we've got Nvidia on 5.5 points. We've got Lossless Scaling on 8 points, and also AMD's AFMF on 8 points. And in some ways, that result, the numbers, that's just a bit of fun, really. The reality is that if Nvidia's stuff just worked, it does have the advantage from an image quality point of view, from my point of view. When I've looked through the footage over and over again, I think Nvidia's got the image quality crown. But as long as the latency is as bad as I'm finding it here, and as long as it's crashing and all sorts of issues, you can't say that it's the best option. And then really, AFMF, if you've got an AMD card, then well, definitely give it a go. It's free, it's on your computer already, so just go into the Adrenaline software and start fiddling around with it. It's worth trying. In Star Citizen, there are cases, like we say, where you're doing more slower paced gameplay, maybe where frame generation stuff can be of a benefit, but I think on the whole, the image quality does fall down a little bit on AMD's option. And Lossless Scaling, it's just amazing, really, that just a small, I think it's a single developer, has pulled off software that's better, really, than Nvidia and AMD. The adaptive frame rate stuff is really clever and really is the future, I think, of this technology. And so with all these videos, I always say it's so cheap, give it a go. And they're obviously, you've got Steam's refund stuff and everything. So it's almost, if you're thinking, oh, do I want to mess around with any FrameGen stuff, I would say give Lossless Scaling a go. It's pretty impressive.